The arena was silent. Jackson stood alone in the center, surrounded by the quiet hum of alien technology. The battle had ended, no explosions, no grand finale. Just the software of the machines that had failed. The alien supercomputers, towering structures of intricate circuits and pulsating light, had ground to a halt, their calculations lost in a mass of tangled code. They had crunched numbers for hours, racing against the clock, but in the end, they couldn't keep up. His heart pounded in his chest, but his expression remained frozen, eyes narrow, lips tight. He glanced at the remnants of the alien force that had gathered to witness the spectacle. The Varesh, their angular bodies silhouetted in the faint glow of the arena's lights, seemed almost human in their reactions: shock, disbelief, and, perhaps, respect. But there was something more unsettling in their silence, something lurking just beneath the surface. They couldn't understand how a human had won, how a simple pen and paper had outperformed their greatest minds. Jackson's mind raced as he looked down at the crumpled sheets of paper in his hand. Numbers. Simple equations. The answer had been there all along, but no one had thought to look for it in the way he had. The Varesh had relied on their machines, their superior technology, their algorithms that they believed would bring them victory. But Jackson had trusted something else. His pulse quickened. There was a satisfaction in this, a deep, almost primal pleasure that came from defying the odds. The Varesh had never seen humanity as a real threat, more like an anomaly in the galaxy, a species barely clinging to survival on a forgotten rock. They had been wrong. He met the gaze of Tressa, his team's lead strategist. Her sharp eyes glinted under the lights, her face unreadable as always. Tressa's role had been crucial in the preliminary phase, analyzing the Varesh's strategies, understanding their patterns. But this final step, this last, impossible part of the challenge, had been Jackson's. And it wasn't just his intellect that had led them to victory. No, it was something deeper. A connection to the chaos of the universe that only humans seem to grasp. But victory wasn't without consequences. The Varesh were proud. They would not take this lightly. Jackson felt the weight of their stares, the silent judgment in their eyes. This wasn't just a game. This was a declaration. The Varesh commander, Karak, finally stepped forward. His elongated features twisted into what could only be described as a sneer. The Varesh were known for their ability to suppress emotion, but it was clear, Karak was furious. "Explain yourself, human," he demanded. His voice was a low, vibrating hum, as if the words themselves could rupture the air. "How did you beat our machines? Your species cannot even comprehend the algorithms our supercomputers process. This is impossible." Jackson's lips curled into a half-smile, the kind that spoke of a quiet defiance. "I didn't beat your machines. I beat your arrogance." The words hung between them, heavy with implication. The Varesh were used to being the pinnacle of intelligence, the masters of calculation and precision. Humans, with their chaotic emotions, irrationality, and flawed minds, had no place in a contest of intellect. But Jackson had proven them wrong. Tressa stepped up beside him, her voice steady but carrying an undercurrent of tension. The answer wasn't in the machine. It was in the problem itself. "You asked the wrong questions." Karak's eyes flashed with a dangerous spark. "You're implying our calculations were flawed?" His voice was low, a growl now, and the Varesh warriors behind him shifted uneasily. Jackson knew they were on the edge. One wrong move, one misstep, and this delicate victory could turn into something far darker. The Varesh weren't just angry, they were humiliated. And when a species that prided itself on its intellect was humiliated, it often led to violence. Jackson's grip tightened on the pen, the only tool he had used to solve the impossible equation. "I'm saying your calculations were incomplete. You relied too much on your machines to think for you. You forgot the most important element of all, unpredictability." He could see it now, his words were sinking in, shifting the mood from rage to something colder, more calculating. The Varesh didn't understand unpredictability. They couldn't. Karak didn't respond at first. Instead, he studied Jackson with a peculiar intensity. The silence stretched on, filling the arena with an almost suffocating tension. Finally, the Varesh commander spoke. "You may have won this battle, human. But the war is far from over." Jackson met his gaze without flinching. The battle was over, yes. But the war? That was something else entirely. Tressa, sensing the danger, stepped closer, her voice almost a whisper. "We've only just begun." And for the first time, Jackson allowed himself to feel the weight of what that truly meant. Jackson's pulse thundered in his ears as the arena doors slammed shut behind him. The echo of the metal closing, cold and final, swallowed the last remnants of the chaotic confrontation. The Varesh stood at the far side of the room, their long limbs poised in unnatural stillness, their eyes, multiple, glowing, locked on him. Every alien, from the high-ranking generals to the lowliest technician, seemed to weigh the human before them. He could almost hear their thoughts. How had this thing done it? Jackson didn't flinch. His fingers twitched, a faint tremor betraying the sharp edge of anxiety that gnawed at him. The pain in his right hand was a dull throb, but he ignored it. The black ink still stained the tips of his fingers, a testament to the impossible victory. He had solved their puzzle, solved it the human way, with nothing more than instinct and the simplest tools. The Varesh had insisted their supercomputers could defeat anything. He hadn't believed that. Not for a second. And now? The atmosphere was charged. Like the air before a storm. "Explain yourself, human," said a voice from the center of the Varesh group. It was deep, resonant, and carried a weight that should have made Jackson feel small. But it didn't. He knew the one speaking, their leader, General Hashiel. Tall, with translucent skin that shimmered under the dim lights, the Varesh general exuded an air of arrogance. His face, if it could be called that, was a mess of sharp angles and alien features that gave nothing away. Jackson cracked a faint smile. "I used pen and paper," he replied, his voice cutting through the tension. The words were simple, but they seemed to catch the general off guard. "Pen and paper?" The general's voice almost seemed to falter. A few of the others, those closest to him, shifted uncomfortably. Jackson didn't care. He'd played their game, and now it was time to remind them who they were up against. "That's right. While your computers were busy choking on their own data, I solved the problem," Jackson continued, his eyes glinting with the remnants of triumph. He took a step forward. "You underestimated humanity, Hashiel. That's your mistake." The general's eyes narrowed, his limbs subtly shifting into a more defensive posture. Jackson noted the movement, his sharp instincts alert to the growing danger. But it wasn't a physical fight he was concerned with. No, this was about pride. And the Varesh had a lot of it. "You think this," Hashiel spat, gesturing to the paper that Jackson still clutched in his hand, "was enough to defeat us? A simple calculation?" Jackson's lips curled into a smirk. "It wasn't the calculation that did it," he said. "It was the thinking. You and your kind, your supercomputers can calculate every variable in the known universe. But you can't think like us. You can't feel." That struck a chord. He saw it in the way Hashiel's eyes flashed, something deep and primal, a crack in the alien veneer. The Varesh, the superior race, had never understood the human capacity for raw emotion, for the unpredictable, impulsive decisions that had driven humanity to both greatness and ruin. "And what happens now, human?" The question wasn't asked out of curiosity, it was a challenge. The silence in the room thickened, almost suffocating. Every Varesh, standing with their eyes fixed on Jackson, seemed to be waiting for the answer. Jackson held up the paper, the crinkled edges almost mocking in their simplicity. "Now?" He paused, allowing the words to hang in the air. "Now, you learn." "Learn?" The word was a slow, deliberate hiss from Hashiel's tongue. He looked almost incredulous. "Learn from you?" "From us," Jackson corrected. "You don't get it. You've spent too long relying on machines, calculators that give you answers without ever questioning why. Humanity doesn't just solve problems. We find meaning in them. He took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "You're afraid of that." It was Hashiel's turn to flinch. The general's gaze flickered to the side, where the other Varesh remained motionless, their strange faces unreadable. Jackson could see it now, the glimmer of doubt that rippled through their ranks, just below the surface. Maybe, just maybe, they had underestimated humanity. "Well, you've learned something now, haven't you?" Jackson's voice dropped, lower this time, sharper. "That even with your God's damned supercomputers, you can't beat what's in here." He tapped his temple once, hard. "And that's why you'll never win." The room held its breath as Jackson let the words sink in. There was a weight now, a new shift in the air. Hashiel's face twitched, the barest sign of hesitation. But before the general could respond, a harsh voice rang out from the shadows. "Enough. This isn't over." Jackson turned slowly, the words settling in like a shiver running down his spine. The new voice, cold and commanding, was a reminder that the true battle had just begun. The room was colder now, the air thick with the tension of unspoken judgment. Jackson stood in the center, facing the Varesh High Command. The commanders, their elongated, sleek forms outlined by the dim lighting, surrounded him, their cold, multifaceted eyes studying him like a specimen under a microscope. His skin prickled under their gaze. "You are impressive," the voice of their leader, HFY SCI, cut through the silence. The words were clipped, heavy with an edge Jackson couldn't quite place. HFY SCI's tone was not one of admiration, but of calculation, like a predator sizing up its prey. Jackson didn't respond immediately. His thoughts were sharp, cutting through the rush of adrenaline that still flooded his veins. The Varesh had underestimated him. They had all underestimated humans. And now, they wanted answers. They wanted why. "Tell us, human," HFY SCI continued, his voice low but resonant, like the hum of a distant storm. "What did your primitive mind use to overcome our superior intellect?" Jackson's lip curled into a slight smile, his eyes flickering briefly to the remnants of the battle arena, the supercomputers, still dormant in their place. "Nothing but the basics." His voice was steady, even as the weight of their gaze grew more intense. "You've been so busy making everything faster, smarter, more complex. But you forgot what it's like to think simply." The room was still. The Varesh commanders exchanged looks, their inner conflict visible only for a moment. Their pride, their arrogance, had been shredded, and they didn't know how to process the breach. Humans had always been seen as inferior in the grand galactic order. Incomprehensibly so. But Jackson had proven them wrong, and that was something the Varesh couldn't easily accept. "Your victory was luck," HFY SCI spat, his multiple eyes narrowing. "Our technology is beyond your reach. You cannot replicate it. You are nothing but a fleeting anomaly in the vastness of the universe." Jackson's gaze never wavered. He'd heard their kind of words before, venomous, dismissive, just a last attempt at salvaging their pride. He could feel it, that crackling undercurrent of something more in the air. But there was more to this, something deeper than just pride. "We'll see," Jackson said, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "You say you're the superior species? Prove it." HFY SCI's eyes flashed, a flicker of something dark and dangerous there, but then he calmed, his posture easing slightly. The corners of his mouth twisted into what might have been a smile, if a smile could ever seem so devoid of warmth. "We will," HFY SCI replied, his voice suddenly smooth, calculated. "But understand this, human, the next game will not be so simple. If you think you can survive another challenge, you are gravely mistaken." Jackson raised an eyebrow. "I'm not afraid of your games." "You should be," HFY SCI said softly. "You have no idea what we're capable of." The room was stifling now, and Jackson's mind raced. His heart still hammered against his ribs, but there was something else, something in HFY SCI's words that made his gut twist. This wasn't just about winning anymore. This was a game of survival. The stakes had just escalated. "What's the catch?" Jackson asked, his voice suddenly cold, sharp with suspicion. "Another puzzle?" Another trap? Vyarkal stepped forward, his presence immense, his gaze unblinking. It will be a test of everything, human. Your mind, your body, your will. We will break you, piece by piece, until you beg for mercy. A tense silence followed. Jackson's pulse thudded against his temple, but the smirk on his face remained, defiant. You've already failed once. What makes you think you can succeed now? Vyarkal's eyes flared, a deep, almost primal anger flaring up behind the layers of calculation. But then, just as quickly, it was gone, replaced with an eerie calm. The next trial begins tomorrow, Vyarkal said, his voice like a cold wind. Prepare yourself, human. This will be the last time you mock us. As the Varesh High Command turned away, leaving Jackson alone in the room, the words echoed in his ears. Prepare yourself. It wasn't a challenge anymore. It was a promise. And Jackson knew, deep in his bones, that surviving this next trial wasn't just about outthinking them. It was about surviving them, the Varesh. The greatest minds in the galaxy, who had just learned that they were no longer invincible. Tomorrow, everything would change. The tension crackled like static in the air, sharp and biting. The Varesh leader, Vyarkal, had not moved. Neither had the others. Jackson, on the other hand, was fighting to keep his breathing steady, trying to maintain his composure despite the gnawing pressure in his gut. Tell us, Vyarkal repeated, his tone growing colder, what drove you to cheat? Jackson's jaw tightened, and for a moment, he thought of the cruel, twisted words he might spit out in response. He had grown up among the brutality of human conflict, where every advantage, every twist, every edge counted. He'd seen war change people, bend them, break them. And yet, even now, the core of humanity, the one thing the Varesh couldn't fathom, was the sheer refusal to yield. He glanced around the chamber, noting the silent, calculating faces of the Varesh officers. It was clear now, they didn't understand. Their supercomputers had calculated every possibility, but they had missed the one thing that had truly driven him. You call it cheating, Jackson said, his voice measured, yet with a fire beneath it. I call it thinking. Humans don't rely on machines to do what we're capable of. We don't let ourselves become dependent on logic alone. We see the cracks, the gaps. We feel the connections others can't. A ripple passed through the Varesh officers. One of them, a younger figure with silvery skin and a snout-like face, made a sound, a sharp, almost imperceptible hiss that might have been a laugh. Your species feels? Vyarkal's voice was laced with derision. How quaint. And that is what defeated us. Jackson locked eyes with the Varesh leader, his heart still pounding but his resolve solidifying. Yes, he said. It's exactly what defeated you. A silence settled again, but this one felt heavier, more deliberate. Jackson stood unwavering, watching as the weight of his words sank in. The Varesh weren't used to losing. Their entire civilization was built on intellect, precision, calculation. They had dominated space for millennia by bending the rules of reality itself, using their supercomputers to predict the future, to outsmart every opponent. They had never faced something they couldn't quantify until now. The younger Varesh officer stepped forward, the soft click of his claws against the metal floor echoing in the tense air. You suggest Instinct 1? His voice was laced with skepticism. Impossible. Jackson's lips curled into a thin smile. Instinct? Maybe. Or maybe it's just human ingenuity. You see, we don't need an algorithm to survive. We improvise. We adapt. And in doing so, we learn to outthink everything that comes our way. Another murmur spread through the room. The Varesh were unsettled. Improvise. The word hung in the air like a curse. Vyarkal stepped closer to Jackson, his large, dark eyes narrowing. You are a dangerous species. You defy logic. You unbalance the very fabric of reality we've so carefully constructed. Jackson's mind raced as he stared up at the alien leader. Maybe that's the problem. You built your reality on something that couldn't bend. The universe doesn't work like that. It's chaotic. It's unpredictable. And it's alive, in ways you'll never understand. The leader's breath was a low growl now, a faint tremor of anger rippling through his controlled demeanor. But Jackson wasn't finished. He couldn't afford to back down. The stakes were too high. What you're seeing, Jackson continued, each word deliberate, is not just a victory over your machines. It's a reminder of something deeper. You think logic and machines are the answer? Fine. But you're wrong. There's something you'll never account for, the human spirit. It's wild. It's unbeatable. It doesn't obey. A flicker of uncertainty passed across HFY's features. For a fleeting moment, Jackson saw it, doubt. The alien leader's eyes flickered away, then back again. This wasn't just about pride anymore. This was about survival. You speak of spirit, HFY muttered, stepping back, as if the weight of Jackson's words had momentarily pushed him off balance. But what does that mean, human? What is it worth in the end? Jackson's eyes flickered, the raw edge of defiance now twisting into something darker, something that bordered on the dangerous. It means everything, he said, his voice low but final. It means that even if you break our bodies, even if you shatter our minds, we'll keep fighting. That's something your machines can never calculate. The room went still again, the tension almost suffocating. Jackson could feel it, the shift. He wasn't just a human in a contest. He was a symbol now. And the Varesh? They had just realized they were facing a force they couldn't defeat, not with all their technology, not with all their calculation. They were up against something far more lethal. Something human.